And we're here in Israel, and we're talking with one of Israel's preeminent archaeologists. Barnett, who are we speaking with today?
We're speaking to Dr. Norma Franklin of the LandMinds Institute of Archaeology, University of Haifa, who we sat in master's classes together. We both had to show up, and attendance was taken for both of us as she finished her doctorate and moved on, and as I was just a little initiate starting. So our paths crossed. Norma, it's a pleasure to have you on the LandMinds show, Foundation Stone.
That would be here.
Now, we've met in the field. We've interviewed you when you were in your season before you started digging, when you were surveying, I think it's 2012?
Originally,
Yeah.
That was our first meeting. I think that's
season
right.
2012.
So 5 years ago, and there are people who have been watching our show and listening that time who will remember it. And therefore, we get a great kick. I'm sure you get more out of it when you find something when, I love it when a plan comes together. You had a plan, which you made with Jenny Ebling. Please tell us about her during the course of the interview.
In archaeological terms, 5 years is not such the short durée, right? But from the archaeological point of view, we're interested in the long durée.
Right.
But you had a plan. Tell us about what you've achieved in the last 5 years.
Well, you have to know the plan and why we went there to begin with, I think, and what we've managed to do, what our aims were, and what we've managed to achieve, and of course, what we haven't managed to achieve.
That's excellent.
No one can claim 100% success in anything, and in archaeology, you never know what you're going to find. You can think you know what you're going to find, but it's always going to be slightly different. There's always going to be surprises all the way. And so we've had our surprises, our good ones and our bad ones.
Well, give us an example of a good one.
No, I first please mention your co-director in full.
Okay, Dr. Jenny Eberling of University of Evansville in Indiana. And she has a long history working in Israel. She's worked on Hatzor. She's an expert in groundstones, in many different aspects of archaeology. And we make a good match because we actually deal with different things. And I think that's a very good way for two directors to work. We're not honing in, each of us, on the same aspect. So we each bring our own strengths to the
So
dig.
what are your strengths and what are Jenny's strengths?
Oh, well, I'm a stratigrapher. I'm very much a field archaeologist. I don't deal with small finds particularly. I definitely don't deal with grinding stones and cooking and food ways, and she does. So that's very basic. Although we don't always like to use the term, I'm more of a biblical archaeologist. I deal with the period of the Hebrew Bible. I deal with the northern kingdom of Israel in particular. Jenny deals with more sort of archaeology where it touches ethnographic studies, and coming together, it has been really great.
You can flesh out the full picture. Yeah.
Okay, now back to our 5-year plan.
Our 5-year plan. Well, our plan was to, I would say, rescue Jezreel from, perhaps oblivion is too strong a word, but total misunderstanding of what was there. And that doesn't mean to say we understood what was there, but we felt there was much more there than people knew. And so our plan was to, first of all, do a survey. We first of all did a LiDAR survey. Now, LiDAR is a laser. It's like doing, and I talked about this, I think, some years ago. But it's a basis. I think every single dig should do LiDAR. It's a useful base, and it'll serve for years to come.
Well, maybe explain to the listeners what the LiDAR shows.
It shows you a topographic plan of the ground. It doesn't go below ground, but it will go below foliage. Now, that's very nice, number one. The second thing it does, it talks to the satellites, right? So you actually, wherever you put your finger, or in usually the case, because it's digitized, you put your mouse, your cursor, you will know where you are in the world. It's attached to the Israel National Grid. So anything we do after that, we can just pop those facts into the LiDAR, and it'll put it in real time in the real place. If you can cut it like you cut a cake, you can cut it, and you can see how it is stratigraphically. It shows you where you are today, because whether we like it or not, the world is changing really fast. And I'm talking not so much about nature, natural disasters are going on. We see Houston now and everything, but man-made. We can't help it. We have more people on this planet than ever before. We have to do farming. We have to build houses. We are changing the environment at a rate that is unprecedented. And so any chance that we have as archaeologists to document how something looks now will also serve anybody in the future.
Look at the Jezreel Valley. We just had the train rip through roads, bridges. You won't recognize the place. If Napoleon came to fight now, he wouldn't know where the turnoff was.
Well, yeah. I mean, things are changing incredibly. So it's fantastic. LiDAR is fantastic for an archaeologist to plug in what they find, because it automatically, using a total station for measurements, for you can plug things in. But it's also terribly important for the future, because it shows you what is there now accurately, not just a sketch, not just a photograph. I mean, you combine it with photographs as well.
Does the LiDAR replace actually surveying with like a total station, or do they work in concert together?
They work in concert. They're different. They're complementary. They're slightly different. They're relatively similar, but they're somewhat different. Think you can have an iPad and you can have a computer. Some things you can do in a computer, you can't do in an iPad, and vice versa.
No,
so the technology...
You're integrating two worlds. You have the advantage of the LiDAR and of walking every step through and plugging.
Absolutely.
So we want to understand what your integrated understanding that goes beyond one or the other.
Yeah, it gives you start seeing anomalies. Now, you can play around with the LiDAR. One of the great things is that we have, thanks to the British, after the First World War, they took a lot of aerial photographs of the whole region. And you take those aerial photographs, they're absolutely, they're not at an angle. They're bird's eye. You put those on the, our guru does.
On the old grid. On the old grid that existed, right? That has to be...
No, you can put them on the LiDAR.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Only if it's an aerial, straight down.
Not if it's oblique. It can't be oblique.
Not oblique, exactly. Thanks for the word. And then it makes things pop out. Things that you look at in an aerial photograph that you might notice, but it's rather flat. You put it on the LiDAR, it puts it immediately into 3D. And then you can play around and you can exaggerate the elevation. So where something was 1 meter in elevation, you make it, say, 2, just for argument's sake. And then it accentuates, and so you really start seeing things that you wouldn't normally notice. Then you put your boots on, go out into the field, and you check. Because perhaps there's something really stupid there, which means nothing. That perhaps when the technology was trying to clear the undergrowth, it didn't clear it properly, and you actually got something which is a nothing. You have to check. It doesn't happen very often, but it's one of the things you have to do.
In the past, we've called that ground truthing, where we go out and we check the test results.
It's ground truthing. It's a ground survey together with. And we know there was occupation. So we didn't do in Israel, it's very necessary, but you have what we call the regular ground survey when you're picking up shards and you're looking to see periods of occupation based on the pottery that you're finding. Well, we knew we had long-term occupation there. So we didn't really do that. We did it very, very, just in a couple of places, just to really reassure ourselves. But what we did, what we call a landscape survey. We were looking for features, rock cut features, and where quarrying had been done, where there were buildings of any time period.
Well, the time period, and I'm going to ask you to give a synopsis, so to speak, of the various time periods, right, that the site is dealing with in Jezreel, right? But before we do that, if you could give us a sense right, of the picture that you're looking at. When you're starting off, you had a vision in 2012, right, and it's now 2017, right? Can you describe the site, the physical site, for
Yes.
the listeners?
Okay. Well, okay. This is to do with why we went there as well and what we've achieved. And one of the reasons, and there's one of a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons is you actually have two sites. There were two tells. No one, well, no one, hardly anyone is aware that there were two tells. The better known tell is the upper tell, which is known simply as Tel Jezreel, which has been excavated in the past, particularly in the 1990s, from 1990 to 96. And then you have a lower tell, which is right next to, just overlooking, it's 10 meters in elevation higher than the perennial spring, which was really the lifeblood, the water that you so need in this part of the world. And that was, it doesn't have such a great elevation as far as we can tell. It's not quite so dominant, but it's there. And it was never excavated. It was surveyed, just one small area of it was surveyed back in 93 and published, but no one had excavated there. And as far as most people who knew about the tell was concerned, it was what we call a prehistory tell, or if you want it, in before the Bible. It was Bronze Age, it was perhaps Chalcolithic, Neolithic, we're going back into prehistory.
I just want to translate for a minute. In other words, we have a long-term occupation, whether it's a city or not, whatever it is a discussion, and you have a particular view on that. And then you're saying that by the spring, there's also signs of habitation, usage, structures, not just the spring. And for those who don't realize why we're talking about it, we're going to talk about how Israel's mentioned in the Bible, but also brings up into modern times as well. It's been a central point all the way through. We'll get to that. But archaeologically, there's two different settlements.
Two tells, and they're nearly 1 kilometer apart, which today, when we're so used to getting into the car with your color, it was nothing. In the old days, that's nothing. Even our grandparents thought nothing of walking a kilometer.
Right.
And a difference in elevation. Now, the lower site, which is, as I say, hardly known about, it was less well known, is right next to the water. So put it this way, you're living in the upper site, which is the well-known site, the site which we'll also discuss. You are not going to let a foreign entity live by your water source. You have to put somebody there who's one of yours. Whether we're talking about family, we're talking about a kingdom, whatever, if we're talking about an army, it doesn't matter. You need your people control.
And we just froze. You still there?
And that's the local story, as opposed to the whole reason why Jezreel is where it is in the Kingdom of Israel, and very important site.
So you're saying that the settlement period of both tells are functioning in parallel?
For a certain period of time. Not we know now more about the prehistory of the Lower Tell, because we've been excavating on the Lower Tell. Our first season of excavation was 2013. And we came down on definitely the all the phases of the early Bronze Age. It's a long period. It's 1,000 years. I mean, we're talking about sort of from 3000 BC going to 2000, in round numbers.
Would you say that the lower tell has a longer history than the upper tell?
Apparently, the trouble is with the upper tell is it was only really excavated down to the Iron Age. Mm-hmm. We know very, very little about the earlier periods. We see earlier material in the fill, in the debris below the Iron Age, but we don't know. We haven't got any architecture. Now, on the lower tell, we've got the opposite. Actually, we have the early architecture. We might even have um, Neolithic. We have a lot of Neolithic pottery that, we're back in prehistory. We have a bit of Chalcolithic. We have all the early Bronze Age, 1,000 years. And we have architecture. Then things get complicated, because if you want things to be easy, forget it in archaeology. We have a lot of pottery from the Iron Age, the biblical period, Iron II, the period of the Kingdom of Israel. We have a lot. We have no architecture. Or we have architecture, we have a bit of architecture that we haven't yet been able to say what period it belongs to. It might belong to that period. It might belong to the Middle Bronze. We're going back in time. It might belong to the early Roman period if we go forward. This year, we had another surprise. We found an incredible amount of Persian period pottery. So we're at the very end of the Iron Age, in the Persian period, and we have building remains, buildings that have just been trashed. Somebody's come in there and taken the building material and just left bits and pieces that they don't want, left a ton of broken pottery, of course, which will probably never be able to be restorable into something because it's all been churned up. Below that, a hint of Middle Bronze, and we have got early Bronze Age.
And all that at the lower Tel.
Sorry?
All that, this is at the lower Tel.
And all at the lower Tel. So, look, one of the reasons let's talk about that's the good part. The disappointment is, and the surprise, the bad surprise, is that the lower Tel, the latest occupation we found is the late Roman period. It seems to be perhaps a way station, a caravanserai or something, which makes perfect sense down by the spring. Makes perfect sense if you know that the Bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, wrote a roadmap, how to get from Caesarea to Megiddo to Jezreel to Beit Shan for people. Which Jezreel
passing right through the valley.
The lower one by the water, so you could get your horses to drink, or he's talking about the upper one? We don't know. Mm-hmm. So that was no surprise. But afterwards, we haven't got occupation. We've got people were visiting. We've got minute amount of Crusader pottery. We've got Crusader occupation on the upper part. But down below, a little bit of Mameluke pottery. But at the moment, we don't think we've got actual occupation. It's more like they've come down, perhaps they had a little encampment there, perhaps they had a couple of soldiers just watching out for the water source. So we were very optimistic when we started finding a lot of Iron Age pottery. We've got a lot of Samaria ware. This is beautiful, fine, highly burnished ware that's called Samaria ware because it was first found at Samaria, the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Great. We're going to find the architecture. We haven't found it.
Not yet.
Not yet. It's frustrating. These are the frustrations you find. It's there. Perhaps it was just one small fortress, and we are literally digging 200 yards that way, or 50 yards that way.
Perhaps it was totally obliterated.
Sorry?
Perhaps it was totally obliterated in the destruction.
It could have been by the Persian period.
But then I would expect to find Assyrian traces. Or Assyrian arrowhead or something.
I can...
A destruction layer.
You're going to lead me onto something else, which I'm happy to talk about in a minute, Barnea, but I think we've got more to talk about to get the listeners to understand the possibilities of Jezreel.
Well, let me sidebar for just 1 second, because what Barnea is raising, and I respect. I will deal with that later.
It's a question, but I'd love to talk about it.
There are two major sites, right, at the end of the First Temple period. One is Samaria, and one is Jezreel.
Megiddo. Okay? Sorry.
So, no. But I'm talking about specifically here.
Okay.
And the reason the
listeners should know that I dug for 19 years at Megiddo. I was one of the founding members of the excavation there.
It's a fantastic site, but the reason I'm raising it is for another purpose. and that is Samaria is extremely dramatic because of the Roman building, which is much later. That's hundreds of years later, right?
I
I'm not so sure, right, that if we would look at Samaria without the Roman layer on it, right,
it
that
would
it would be
look,
any different than Jezreel. So
no, it would look fantastic.
you think it would still it would still be significantly different than Jezreel in the same period?
It is an amazing site that if I'm complaining that we didn't know much about Jezreel, there was much more to Samaria. But it's not going to happen in our lifetime or anybody else's at the moment.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah, it's incredible. But Jezreel has a very close connection with Samaria, which I didn't want to get sidetracked to yet, but I'll talk about it.
Okay, at your pace.
No, because I wanted everybody to know what. Okay, so we're digging down on the lower Tel. So what about the upper Tel? Why aren't we there? And one of our jobs is to find the connection between the two, because so we did, as we say, about the LiDAR. We did landscape survey. We've walked. We've looked. We've gone around with metal detectors.
Crawled into caves, even when they said don't.
That's part of the course. Crawling into caves is always getting out of them. Crawling out of them. That's the difficult bit sometimes. We wanted to see the connection. If you have two tells, and you're saying, or we are saying, that there's a connection between the two because of the water source, let's look for the connection. And that's what we found. We have found evidence for two paths. Both of the paths, as far as we can tell, go from the spring. They go up to the lower Tel through a narrow sort of wadi, a narrow little gully. They go across the lower Tel. They then go across the field. The field today has no sign of that path because of modern agriculture. But using the British aerial photographs combined with the LiDAR, we see exactly where that path is.
It's both.
Right?
It's the photograph on the. It's not the LiDAR by itself. It's laying the old photograph on the LiDAR.
Yes, because
somebody here is thinking about Yavna. I don't know if the other, but somebody here is thinking about Yavna. I just want to mention.
No, because I tell you why. It depends what modern agriculture has taken place. Because it's farmed by the kibbutz, it's large agricultural terraces. You know, with combine harvesters, with tractors, with the works. It means that the earth has been turned to such a degree, and perhaps earth has been added from elsewhere or from locally, you've destroyed anything that the LiDAR is going to see. That's why it's important to do LiDAR now, as soon as possible, for any site that is going to be excavated at any time in the future. And it can be 20 years. Perhaps there's no plan to do it, but it should have a LiDAR scan done.
For the best results,
your basis.
Right.
So no, that would have been lost if we didn't have the British. So thanks for the British military RAF photographs. Combine that with the LiDAR, we know accurately where the path is. Remember, LiDAR automatically connects it to the satellites and to the national grid. So it's now on the national grid and not just, oh, that's a nice photo.
Aaron Mayer found a collection of German aerial photographs.
There are as well. Yes, there's the German. But in the case of Jezreel, the British ones are more efficient, are more valuable to us.
They're newer. They're probably superior in their quality than what the Germans.
No. It's a year or two different.
That's it.
It's World War One. Yeah.
Yeah. No, the Germans are interested in something. We do have the British. We have the earliest one we have is the British from 1918, World War One. It's fantastic, but because they were looking for the invasion but it's not, the quality is not good enough to combine with the LiDAR. Mm-hmm. So
it is 100
it's valuable. It's valuable.
It is 100. Yeah, right. Yeah.
But okay. So we found a path. It was very easily traceable. We found how we could walk it. We walked up it. We discovered that at one point it branches. It goes, one branch goes to the far west of the upper Tel, and one branch goes up to the, more about the middle of the upper Tel. We documented it, and we excavated part of it. What do we find? That was the Roman track.
That was the Roman track.
Yes. Now, could say Norma was a little bit disappointed it wasn't the Iron Age. We found no evidence of Iron Age. We had Roman sandal nails. At higher level, we had Crusader period, or I should say medieval period horseshoe nails. They're very different. I knew nothing about horseshoe nails. Now I can tell you what's the medieval one. It wasn't my thing. But we had a medieval specialist with us. Great. Back to the LiDAR. We found another track, which there was no way we could even see it visually. We had to keep sending SOSs to our guru to say, okay, and we're going there with the total station, literally plotting it. It looked like nothing. And yet, when we look at the LiDAR and we look at aerial photographs combined together, we seem to have a track which goes up the slope in the opposite direction initially to the Tel. The Tel is very slightly to the west and obviously to the south, the upper Tel. It goes to the east at a very nice gradient, and then it does a 90-degree turn and goes straight towards where the Iron Age gate was. The connection has been totally lost by modern, not agriculture in this case, but building, the car park, the modern road, etc. It's gone. We did do one test trench there, and we might have missed it by just a meter, but we don't know. We couldn't find anything. So we have the visual record. The only reason to have something going up the slope, doing a 90-degree angle towards the Iron Age gate, is it looks like an Iron Age road. But, it's, as they say, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. I'm hoping that's it, but I doubt very much that I will be able to prove it. It's an option.
Well, we hope that you will iron it out.
I hope I will iron it out, but yeah. It's very interesting, all I can say. So, but we can see it's a road, right?
So if
there, who used it, who built it, who traversed it, I don't know. But there's no, to my mind, it's very strange that it goes exactly towards the gate, and you can see that when you look at, as I say, not so much the LiDAR for the area by the gate, but when you look at the before everything was destroyed there by modern building.
Doesn't this sound like the ideal circumstance to bring in geophysics? Doesn't it? Like, I have the gate, right? I have these questions. I can now follow the track of the gate, right, to identify, right, the walls, to identify the features.
Can't I see through the car park with different methods?
No, I tell you, it has been totally obliterated there. There's been it's a rather a sad story, because in 1986, somebody had, as I say, the bright idea to build a museum. Now, I've got nothing against museums, but they decided to build it east of the Upper Tel, thinking there was nothing there. Not only, if it was a museum to Jezreel and the history of Jezreel, I'd say, okay, that's nice. No, it was a history to do with the settlement of the Jezreel Valley that was purchased by Hankin, which is, in modern history, has a completely different history to the site of Jezreel. A bulldozer goes in, starts clearing everything in sight. That's how they discovered that the Upper Tel had a corner tower, because the bulldozer simply chipped a piece off. And then they carried on, then the bulldozer, they discovered the moat, that there's a moat around the Upper Tel, bulldozer fell in it. They still carried on, and they have destroyed, so much was destroyed up there, that we've lost that connection.
Wow.
It's really sad. But you, as I say, you look at the old photographs and you combine
But wasn't
with
a salvage
you know
excavation
exactly
done
where
at that
it
time?
was.
What?
So
No salvage excavation either, huh?
No.
There was no salvage excavation.
yes, but it was early days. People looked at the Tel. You know, sadly, Israel is we're way ahead in many things. We're rather behind in landscape archaeology, which is done in because we have tells. Other countries don't have tells, so we're very
It
tell
drew the
focused.
focus to the Tel.
And you forget, look around you.
The last Bar Ilan conference, I think it was the Bar Ilan conference in Jerusalem, someone exploded against a particular dig for a total ignorance and lack of landscape archaeology, which everywhere else in the world is fundamental. It was embarrassing. I found it funny because I know that that archaeologist is a chassid, is a fan of landscape archaeology, and was being castigated in front of hundreds of people, actually less people there at the end of the day, but for it. And you're explaining not just the old focus of where the goodies, and I forget whole pots, and I want royal architecture, but that Tel draws me into Tel, and I have to, and it takes so much energy, like hundreds of years to go for Chatzor, for example, and therefore who's looking around the landscape? The Americans did in Shechem. The Americans dedicated time, the right excavation.
Yeah,
and
but this is old days before they
also
really
old days.
What landscape archaeology was. It's come a long way, and we're catching up here. But it's sad because you know, people are still a lot of people are Tel focused. You have to understand the road system. Where were people coming to? Where were they going to? Where was the entrance? You know, we can say, okay, there's the city gate. We know how they came in the site, but where were they coming from? How did they approach it? Where did they bury people? Because that's also, when you know the size of, if you know the outline of your settlement, you have to start looking to where they buried people. And in different periods, there were different fashions for where you buried people vis-a-vis the roads. So, you know, you can learn a lot from looking around and understand. You have to look to try. I talk to people about the Jezreel Valley, and they'll say, yes, but it was terrible. It was full of swamps. And I say, that's modern. In our terms, it's modern. There were no swamps way back. This is all to do with deforestation and neglect of the land and earth coming down from those deforested hills, and the valley, the level of the valley has risen.
How much? How much would you say it's risen? Is there a way to know?
There is, but again, not many people. Now, we did it, my Megiddo days, we had Arlene Rosen with us, Professor Arlene Rosen, who's an expert on this, and they went out and they dug in a sort of side valley by Megiddo. I think it was 12 meters before they got down to the Byzantine.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
Whoa!
Right.
Don't quote me, but I think it was 12 there.
Wow.
Now, it doesn't mean to say it's going to be 12 everywhere, or 5, or 3.
I think we were 15 meters in Yavna before we got to Byzantine, something like that, right? It was incredibly deep.
It's you see, and when you have the hills,
It was 5 meters to the early Islamic period.
Right. Right, but it depends where you are. If you're at the bottom of a valley and you've got mountains, hills like mountains for us, hills for other people overseas, which were once densely forested, those forests have been lost, all the soil is lost, they come down. It's total degradation of why have we got bare hills? Why have Keren Kayemet, the Jewish National Fund, done such incredible work for reforesting?
Right.
Because there were forests there. You cut down your tree, you lose your soil, unless you're there building a terrace or something to preserve it, because you're planting other things. So
we broke your flow of thought. So let's come back. So you were explaining the lower Tel and then the connection to the upper Tel and
so
to
we've had
the
success, but partial. We have seen the connection.
This is a city of two Tels.
Yes.
As opposed to a very Dickensian kind of.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
You
And
stay on
that-
track, Norma. Don't let us distract you. You
No,
stay
let
on
me
track.
just say, that's not unusual. Go to a lot of the coastal sites. Ashdod, it was a city of two towns.
Yeah, but for
Ashdod,
different reasons.
next to the sea, the
And they're-
one that was
and
near
much
the
further
highway.
apart.
Not so far
So-
apart, but the port. That's the port city. Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
they had
and
the
so-
sand dunes in between, so you couldn't put the port. So it's for different reasons.
In Shiloh, I don't know of a tell by the spring that's less than a kilometer away. In Megiddo, I don't know of a tell by a spring that's in the running valley. I don't know of another example.
I agree with you. It's a problem, which is why they dismiss the lower tell as nothing to do with the upper tell. And I said no, because you can say a kilometer's too far. Yeah, it's far. But on the other hand, that's your water source, and you're living up there. There's going to be somebody else down there. So you have to have an outpost at least. There has to be something.
Well, how did they get
Now-
the water from the spring to the upper city? Do we know the answer to that?
Well, we did a few experiments with some of our students. If you go back to forget all those beautiful photographs and modern day of Arab ladies, and also in the Victorian times having the jar on their head. They did not carry jars on their heads in the period of the Hebrew Bible, on your shoulder. So we had some volunteer students fill up jars. Actually, they were plastic containers.
And
Down
carry them up.
and put them on their shoulder, and they walked. And we saw, how difficult was this? It wasn't that bad at all. And if you've got enough manpower, or usually woman power, donkey power, etc., you can bring that water up.
Mm-hmm.
There is another source on the upper tell, which I haven't written about yet, but we do have a small phenomenon of something which is called a seepage well. It's been found in Neolithic sites. A Neolithic site, but I have one which appears to be within an Iron Age building. I say appears because, once again, it's so near the surface, I can't prove it categorically, but it's where the upper tell of Jezreel is actually on a shoulder of the Gilboa. So if it rains up on the Gilboa, water sinks in, it can percolate underneath the ground. Or in this case, it's limestone. And with limestone, you have it. Limestone, when it becomes in contact with oxygen over thousands of years, you get a hard crust, outer crust, called Nari, N-A-R-I, and you have the regular, in this case, Eocene limestone below. Between the hard crust, the water could percolate down. And so we found one of these seepage wells. It's full of water. The water is fresh. It will come in underground, so it's not contaminated. There was one of those that we found on the upper side.
Interesting.
It's not enough, but it's there. There might be, perhaps there's 5.
I don't know if you want to address this now, but you also identified in a unique way water storage on top of the hill that others missed.
No, I think you're...
The wine, you're talking the wine storage?
No. You're talking about the so-called cisterns, the bell-shaped. They're not.
No, you are saying that most of them were silos and not cisterns.
Yes.
The other way around. I was going against the grain. There's 100 of
so
them.
to speak.
100 of them. When you have a lip, right, to seal it, then you know it's a silo. And so what others identified as cisterns, you identify as silos, which has to do with Yisrael and the fertility of the grain of the valley, right, although there's some water on top. Okay, very good.
Well, yeah, but you can see the difference very quickly between a seepage well and a grain silo. Both of them have a circular opening. That's where the similarity stops. But I have a paper coming out very soon on these grain silos. It's not unique to Jezreel, but Jezreel has more than any other site that I know of at the moment. At Samaria, we have about 30, perhaps 40 of them that have been discovered. At Tel Jezreel, which is near Jerusalem, Saul's kingdom of Saul, Saul's first capital. We have them in Gibeon and elsewhere, wherever you're near the bedrock. We don't have them in Megiddo simply because very little of the bedrock has been exposed, and perhaps we don't have them at all. Mm-hmm. Because they have a long, the only way you could really date them is try and figure out what they might cut through. So at Samaria, they precede the 9th century palace of King Omri and Ahab. They're earlier than that. And because we know that Samaria wasn't occupied much earlier, they're probably 10th century.
How do we know that? From archaeology, or are you referring to the Bible text?
Both.
Both.
When you read the Bible text, they were buying the site. It doesn't mean to say the site was empty. It could have had people living there before. Kathleen Kenyon, but now we're going to Samaria, not Jezreel, she said she thought it was just an empty site. But it didn't say it was an empty site. It just said he was buying it from Shemer.
From Shemer, which and
but when you look at the archaeology, you have no early material except for 10th century and then 9th century, and then it goes all the way to the Roman period. So we've really strayed now to Samaria. So can I continue with the connection between Jezreel and Samaria?
Yes.
Okay. What is the function of Jezreel? Why is Jezreel so important? Well, you have to know your road system. Now, and you have to know where your enemy is. Now, yes, Megiddo is really important. Megiddo is amazing. I dug there. I love it. I know it better than my own apartment. But Megiddo was of major military importance when your enemy was Egypt. Because Egypt would come north, up the way of the sea, up the Via Maris, and then if they turned inland to get to the breadbasket, the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo was stopping them. Now, when your enemy was Assyria or the Arameans, modern-day Iraq and Syria, Megiddo was no good. You already got all the way through, and you could turn off and go south to Samaria. You had to have a site that was protecting Samaria. Now, obviously, it wasn't the only site that protected Samaria. Once they got across the Jordan River, once they got past perhaps Beit Shan or any other of the fords, hopefully they would be stopped then. But that doesn't mean to say they could be or they would be. You
Hopefully she'll come back. Can you hear us?
The site of Jezreel is at its narrowest. Now, as I'd said before, valleys are now wider. Why? Because earth has come up, and so your valley that perhaps went down like this now only goes like this. So it's now wider than it probably was in ancient times, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. Think about the Jerusalem Road Highway. It's now wider. Why? They've just done a new road and put in tons and tons of materials and able to have it wider.
Correct.
Not so far down. So it was narrow at one time. It's still the narrowest point, opposite the biblical city of Shunem. Two very important sites opposite one another at the narrowest point. It's from Jezreel that the main highway goes south to the capital of Samaria. So Jezreel is your guardian for Samaria. And that was, in the biblical period, its great importance. Because you had to get past Jezreel to get to Samaria. You couldn't get to, it was very difficult. Nothing's impossible, but to get an army down the Jordan Valley and then come up, say where biblical Tirzo is, Tel Jezreel, anywhere else, I don't know whether you've done that in modern days in a car, It's like being on one of those mountain railways in a Luna Park, in a fun fair. You're
Right.
up, you're down, you're up. It's insane. It's incredible. Beautiful scenery. You don't want to take an army that way.
Right.
Army into the Jezreel Valley, down the Via Maris, which stretches all the way. You've got from Mesopotamia. Turn south at Jezreel. You're in the capital of the Kingdom of Israel.
Yeah, you're in the heart of the country. Once you've taken that territory, you're in the heart of the country.
Right. So that's in the biblical period. That's why we get Jezreel mentioned more than 30 times in the Hebrew Bible, because it was protecting the capital. It was of extreme importance all the way through. You had to have the military. And now the excavators of the Upper Tel, David Yusiskin, he correctly said it's a military compound. He could only say that after excavation because he didn't find anybody living there. There was no evidence of domestic structures in that time period. Now, he and I have a big disagreement about the actual time period. Because of the wonderful story about Jezebel and Naboth's vineyard and everything that happens approximately 10, 20 years later with the death of Jezebel, he based what he found on the biblical narrative, not on the archaeology, not on what he found, not on the pottery. And you just open up any of his publications that deal with Jezreel, whether it's the preliminary reports or the more popular books, he says based on the biblical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of respect for W. Siskin.
But it's a long time ago. The world has changed. The world has changed.
Yes. So now, it's interesting. I am one of the low chronology people. My PhD advisor, one of them, was Israel Finkelstein, and I was with him all the way on the so-called, then back in '94, low chronology. But it's actually interesting because it's the high chronology people who are hanging out, like Amnon Bentor, who actually give me support without meaning to, because they immediately, Amnon Bentor wrote that Jezreel is exactly the same as Megiddo Stratum 4, because for him, Megiddo Stratum 4 was onward. For me, for Israel Finkelstein and for David Yusiskin, it's not. Actually, I don't know about David, but definitely for myself and Israel Finkelstein and many others, Megiddo Stratum 4 no longer belongs to the Omrites. It's not 9th century, it's gone down to 8th century, it's Jeroboam II, if you want the name of the king. So, you've got to see, if these two things are in parallel, then you've got to ask the question, well, why did you have this great Megiddo with all the stables, and at the same time you have Jezreel with the upper city with an enclosure? And there's a very good answer for that. Megiddo is much larger. I mean, there's no comparison, and I can't even begin. I should be able to tell you the hectares and everything else, but just say it's a heck of a lot bigger. It's on the major trade route, because you've got a north-south route
and an east-west route,
and you go east. Well, west you get into the sea pretty quickly at Dor, or wherever, Caesarea.
But then you're on the coastal road. That's to the west.
Yeah, but it's trade, and they're trading, they're training, and they're trading horses. They're horses for the chariots. Which doesn't mean to say it doesn't have a military purpose, but as I just explained, when your enemy is coming from the east, the military role of Megiddo is less at that time period than the military role of Jezreel. So for me, they exist at the same time. But Jezreel has a specific function. It's protecting Samaria. Now, Samaria is incredible. It's an incredible site. We only know that much of it in the biblical period. We only know the Acropolis. We know nothing, zero, about the lower city. which existed, definitely existed.
But maybe there's a hint in the biblical verse of Shaul and his family and his army gathering, but
Saul,
the
King
aim
Saul.
at Asher Yisrael at the spring of Jezreel, not just it's in the valley and there's water there, maybe also because there's some type of servicing for the military there, some type of protection there, some type of staging grounds. Because if you have
Well, yeah, you're right, because the road south didn't, the road to Samaria at the time of Saul, if we presume that Samaria as an important city, it wasn't the capital of Israel, it was perhaps somebody's farm, right? It might have been an important farm, but it wasn't the capital. But the road existed. It went to the more ancient site of Shechem. You wanted to get to Shechem, you had to go via Jezreel.
right, but also to be safely gathered in an area to face the Philistines who are going to be coming from the west, I think that I'm ensconced in a good area and I'm protected. I'm just saying that what you've made me think of is that since there's earlier fortifications which may still have been intact at that time, that maybe there was a purpose then, give or take 3,000 years ago, to the lower Tel, right, when nothing was happening on the upper Tel necessarily.
We haven't got any Iron One that we know of in the lower Tel or in the upper.
Okay.
So actually, it looks more like a quiet time. It doesn't mean to say it's not there. The upper Tel hasn't been published and doesn't look like it will be for many unfortunate reasons. But the lower Tel, we are coming up to after our season next year, we'll be getting into serious publication.
Very good. The in thing now is to give a master's or a doctoral student that which will otherwise never get published. There's a number of things cooking like that. Couldn't this be it?
What were you talking about, the upper Tel or the lower?
I'm saying for the upper Tel, could not some...
No, it's a complex question. It's a very complex. It's not for me. It's not my story to go into at the moment.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
So we look forward to the publication, right, into the future, and we have to break, but we can consider this a part one. Because there's still a lot of history at Jezreel that we haven't touched.
Why is Jezreel important? Who cares about this? What happened over there?
So we're gonna have to do a part two.
But the unique things here that you have questions and are analyzing things because of the groundwork which you put in and the science which you put in and the different surveys. You are grappling with questions that nobody has grappled with. Not just unique to the site. The manner of your grappling is very, very unique.
Yeah, and we have to talk about the Roman graves that we photographed from the air. But there's a lot more to talk about.
We have something for everybody.
That's right. That's right. In every period.
What period are you interested in? Basically, we've got it, except for perhaps Iron One. Sorry.
So, Dr. Norma Franklin, I want to thank you for spending time with us and sharing with us a view of Jezreel. And we invite you back for more into the future.
This is Barney Levy Sullivan.
And David Wilner. Thanks for joining us on this wonderful Jezreel podcast.
Of LandMinds Foundation.
Thank you. Bye.